I am William Gasser, Director of American Armoured Foundation Tank and Ordnance War Memorial Museum located here in Danville, Virginia. Today we're going to discuss briefly the history of the tank. The tank basically was a concept going back in early history. There are examples in nature that can be called the tank. There are examples from Leonardo da Vinci. There are countless examples. But the tank was constructed from ideas from several individuals and several nations because of the great need to break the stalemate on the Western Front in World War I. World War I, 1914 to 1918. The meat grinder, as it was called, was devastating the armies. A solution was needed. These far-thinking individuals came up with the caterpillar track idea, adapted to the use of a military vehicle. It became the tank. First fielded in France in Flers Courcelette in September of 1916, the tank had a rather inauspicious beginning. Essentially, it was a failure. Not because of its idea, which was way ahead of its time. It was actually a failure because it was so new, it was not understood how to use the weapon. Both the tank and the airplane in World War I were not very effective, not because of the design, but because the design had not been perfected, and the generals didn't really know how to use it. There wasn't a rule book printed called Tank 101 somebody could refer to understand how to use a tank, how to deploy it. So everything had to be learned from scratch, which essentially means learn by mistake. So the beginning of the tank was not very successful. However, it did unlock the stalemate on the Western Front and allow some movement. Now we walk ourselves into World War II, 1939 to 45. Interestingly, the Germans and the Allies learned totally different lessons of tank warfare. The Allies learned that the tank was an infantry support vehicle. Keep up with the infantry and support the infantry. That was the lessons they learned on the Western Front. But now we have the Germans. The Germans learned a totally different set of ideas from this because they were on the receiving end, and they saw the tank as a breakthrough device. In the very first battles of World War II, the Germans unhindered the tank from the infantry and used it as a spearhead device, a frontline item that could penetrate far ahead, wreak havoc to the enemy. However, they were smart enough to realize the tank by itself was vulnerable. Therefore, they supported it with mechanized artillery, mechanized infantry, and tactical air support, where the Allies kept it pretty much tied to the infantry. Each one had its merits depending on the perspective of those who had used it prior. This led in World War II to the Blitzkrieg, and soon the true potential of the tank was realized. It is a spearhead device, although not invulnerable, not to be used solely by itself, but in a combined arms team format. The Allies soon caught on, and by 1941, the German Blitzkrieg had ground to a halt through attrition, and now the Allies, formerly on the receiving end, unhindered the tank to the infantry and started their own combined arms teams, and the Blitzkrieg was now in reverse. And this led to the massive breakthroughs both in the Soviet Union and on the Western Front and the Mediterranean theaters. The Germans were now on the receiving end. They didn't have the military, they didn't have the manpower, they didn't have the raw materials to sustain a large mechanized army. So they had to basically go on the defensive, which the tank had its merits. It still makes a pretty good pillbox in some respects, but that is not its true potential. The Allies were on the offensive and mobile, and the true use of the tank was now seen. As the war closed, the tank was pretty much forgotten, not really necessary because there weren't any more wars in vision, and we soon fell right into the Korean War. Korean War was unique. It was not a mobile warfare type of a campaign. What happened in Korea was mostly more static fighting, fighting in really horrible weather, fighting to defend hilltops, ridges, and so forth. So the tank there became very similar to how the tank was employed in the Pacific theater. Not usually en masse, as they call it, but used in small groups to break fortifications, bunkers, fortified lines, and so forth. There was very little tank-to-tank combat during the Korean War. But the tank still had a lot of armor, had mobility. It was an artillery piece on tracks that could go here to there, where you needed it, when you needed it. So it proved to be very useful where other forms of artillery and warfare were not really as practical. Once again, the war ends, defense budgets come into play, and things get scaled down, and the tank was so-called shelved again, never really forgotten, just not really maintained to the high warlike degree that you would expect when you're in a war mentality. and we rolled ourselves into a few brush wars, and we also rolled into Vietnam. Again, Vietnam not being so much like the typical World War II battles, but it did often resemble many campaigns in the Pacific Theater, where the tank in small groups, defending roads, fire bases, busting bunkers, became a very effective weapon, but never really on a tank-to-tank basis as the big battles of World War II. However, the military finally realized that the tank was here to stay, and it had uses in virtually all forms of warfare. That's a concept that had to be relearned through Korea, through Vietnam. The tank was never forgotten, but it was never embraced as we can use this for any place, any time mentality. Today, the tank has finally been accepted by even its competitor branches of the military, artillery, mechanized infantry, where the tank has its place and will always have its place. Today we see the effectiveness of armor in areas of Afghanistan. You also see it in Iraq. You see mobile warfare coming back. You'll see forms of mountain warfare, forms of bunker busting, forms of warfare where the tank shows that it's in its element. And it has been learned that it is here to stay, will always be that way, but it has to grow like all weapon systems. What the tank of the future will be is hard to say. It'll probably be more of a hovercraft, heavily armored, highly mobile, hunts in packs, but not tethered to the ground. That's probably the envisionment. It'll probably have a weapon system totally alien to what we can imagine today. Certainly the old gunpowder cannon will be gone, but who knows where it'll take us. But it will still be here. When it boils down to nuts and bolts, someone has to take the enemy flag. And who's going to do it? You'd rather be in 60 tons of steel or ceramic armor.